than 3,000 years, he lay waiting in the dark, sealed inside a tomb that the world had forgotten. Surrounded by gold and silence, his body held a secret that no grave robber, no conqueror, no ambitious pharaoh could ever steal. It took modern science to find it, and when scientists finally did, what they uncovered wasn't just the cause of a young king's death, it was the story of an entire bloodline turning against itself. His golden mask is still one of the most arresting objects ever pulled from the earth. That serene, perfect face, calm, commanding, ageless, has stared out from museum walls and history textbooks for over a century. It is the image of power made permanent. But that face was a lie. A magnificent, carefully crafted lie. The young man buried beneath it was broken in ways that the artists were forbidden to show, and that historians, for decades, never suspected. For years, the central mystery surrounding Tutankhamun was deceptively simple. Why did a pharaoh die at 19? A hole discovered at the base of his skull gave the world its first answer, and it was a dramatic one. Murder, assassination, palace conspiracy. The idea was irresistible. A boy king, powerful enemies circling the throne, a fatal blow delivered in the dark. It became one of history's most seductive cold cases. But the murder theory, compelling as it was, had a fatal weakness. It was built on suspicion, not evidence, and in the early years of the 21st century, a team of scientists decided it was time to stop speculating and start listening to the bones. To understand what those bones revealed, you have to understand the world Tutankhamun was born into. Not the world of his reign, but the world of his grandfathers, because the catastrophe written into his DNA didn't begin with him. It began at least 2 generations before he ever drew breath. Around 1390 BCE, Egypt was the most powerful civilization on earth. Under Amenhotep III, the empire stretched. From the Euphrates River in the northeast to deep into Nubia in the south, the treasury overflowed, the temples were magnificent, the old gods were strong, and the priests who served them were stronger still. It was a civilization at its absolute apex, and like all things at their apex, it was already beginning its descent. When Amenhotep III died, his son inherited not just an empire, but a religious powder keg. The new king despised the priests of Amun and the stranglehold they held over Egypt's spiritual and political life. So he did something almost incomprehensible. He abolished them. He shuttered the old temples, redirected their wealth, and declared that there was only one god worthy of worship. The Aten, the solar disk, he abandoned the ancient capital of Thebes and built an entirely new city from nothing in the desert, a place called Akhenaten, known today as Amarna, and he changed his own name to match his new god. He became Akhenaten. This wasn't a reformation, it was a rupture. Everything Egypt had been for 1,500 years. Akhenaten tried to unmake in a single reign, and it was into this atmosphere of upheaval, erasure, and radical reinvention that a child was born who would, within a decade, be expected to put it all back together. That child was born with the name Tutankhaten, living image of the Aten. When Akhenaten died, this boy, somewhere around 9 years old, was placed on the throne of the most powerful nation on earth. The priests of Amun guided his hand. He changed his name to Tutankhamun. He restored the old temples, reopened the sanctuaries, and officially declared the revolution over. A child king performing the work of political restoration while the adults around him maneuvered for position. He ruled for roughly a decade. He died before he turned 20, and he left no surviving heir. The question of why consumed researchers for generations, but starting in the early 2000s, a new kind of answer became possible. Ancient DNA analysis had advanced to the point where, if handled with extraordinary care, it might be extracted even from mummies thousands of years old. The risk of contamination, of modern DNA flooding the samples and drowning out the ancient signal, was severe, but a dedicated laboratory established in 2008 within the Egyptian Museum in Cairo changed what was possible. The project was led by Zahi Hawass, Egypt's former Secretary General of Antiquities. Alongside a team of geneticists and radiologists, their goal was direct and ambitious. Map Tutankhamun's family tree using the mummies themselves as evidence, and use that map to understand how and why he died. 11 royal mummies were sampled. Bone tissue, specifically from the dense cortical bone of the femur, was extracted under sterile conditions. The mummification process had done its worst. Centuries of resin, natron salts, and linen wrapping had degraded much of the genetic material. Scientists spent months isolating fragments of usable DNA from the contaminated tissue. It was painstaking, grinding work, but it paid off. The first question was the most fundamental: who was Tutankhamun's father? 3 candidates existed in the historical record. The most logical was Akhenaten himself, but some scholars had proposed his grandfather, Amenhotep III, or a shadowy, short-lived pharaoh named Smenkhkare, whose reign, if it even happened, lasted perhaps a year or two and left almost no trace. The answer was buried inside a tomb in the Valley of the Kings, labeled only by its excavation number, KV55. The mummy inside had been stripped of its identity with deliberate violence. The cartouches on the coffin had been chiseled away. The face of the funerary mask had been removed. Whoever this person had been, someone had wanted them erased from eternity. DNA analysis doesn't care about erasure. The Y chromosome profile of the KV55 mummy matched Tutankhamun's with the specificity you'd expect between a father and a son. And crucially, the same mummy shared DNA with individuals identified through other samples as Amenhotep III and his principal wife, Tae. The KV55 mummy was their child, and Tutankhamun's father, when this genetic data was cross-referenced with age estimates from the skeletal remains. The most supported conclusion was that KV55 was Akhenaten. The heretic king confirmed not by inscription, not by a temple wall, but by his own chromosomes. That was remarkable, but it wasn't the shock. The shock was Tutankhamun's mother. A mummy found years earlier in a side chamber of another Valley of the Kings tomb, designated KV35, had been given a working name by archaeologists, the Younger Lady. She had been discovered lying unceremoniously on the floor, her wrappings torn open, her face mutilated. Whoever she had been in life, she had been treated in death with something close to contempt. Her identity had remained unknown for decades. When her DNA was analyzed and compared with Tutankhamun's, the match was exact. She was his mother. That much was extraordinary on its own. The nameless, damaged woman on the floor of a side chamber was the mother of one of history's most famous kings. But then the researchers looked more carefully at her genetic relationship to KV55. They were siblings, full siblings, the same mother, the same father, both children of Amenhotep III and Tiye. Tutankhamun was not the child of a king and a queen from separate bloodlines. He was the child of a brother and a sister. In ancient Egypt, this was not unthinkable. The mythology of kingship was saturated with divine siblings who married. Osiris and Isis were the most sacred example. Royal marriages within families were used to concentrate power and preserve the purity of the divine bloodline. Cousins, half-siblings, and sometimes full siblings entered into unions that politics and theology endorsed. But genetics operates by different rules than theology, and it is indifferent to divine precedent. When 2 full siblings produce a child, the probability that harmful recessive genes will be expressed in that child rises dramatically. Normally, a damaging recessive mutation requires 2 copies, one from each parent, to manifest. When both parents share large portions of the same genetic inheritance, the odds of those 2 copies lining up become far, far higher. The body has fewer functional alternatives to fall back on. The vulnerabilities multiply. Tutankhamun paid for this in his bones. CT scans of his mummy, thousands of cross-sectional images assembled into a three-dimensional portrait of his skeleton, told a story that his portrait artists had been ordered to conceal. His left foot was severely deformed by a condition called club foot, where the foot is twisted inward and the bones develop abnormally. But it wasn't only the shape of the foot. The bones of several of his toes were dying. The condition is called vascular necrosis. The blood supply to the bone tissue is interrupted. The bone begins to collapse from within, and the tissue around it dies. It is agonizing. It is progressive. And in Tutankhamun's case, it affected multiple bones simultaneously, suggesting a genetic predisposition rather than a single traumatic injury. When excavators first cataloged the contents of his tomb, they noted an unusual number of walking sticks, 130 of them. Some were carved from rare wood, some tipped with gold, some clearly ceremonial. For a long time, scholars assumed they were symbols of royal authority. Pharaohs were depicted with crooks and flails and staffs as emblems of divine power. The canes were interpreted the same way. The CT scans reframed every single one of them. Those were not symbols, those were tools. Tutankhamun could not walk without support. The artwork that shows him seated during activities where other pharaohs stood, hunting, archery, ritual observance, was not an artistic choice. It was a record of physical reality. The boy inside the golden mask spent his reign in pain, unable to place his full weight on a foot that was slowly destroying itself from the inside. And that was before the malaria. DNA testing on Tutankhamun's remains identified genetic material from Plasmodium falciparum, the most lethal of the malaria-causing parasites, not once, but evidence suggesting multiple infections over time. Malaria has been present in the Nile Valley for millennia. The water, the heat, the irrigation channels all created perfect conditions for the mosquitoes that carry it. Exposure was common in a healthy individual with a robust immune system. Malaria is survivable, horrible, debilitating, but survivable. Tutankhamun was not healthy. His immune system was already compromised by the compounding effects of his genetic inheritance. His body was fighting itself on multiple fronts simultaneously: bone disease, chronic pain, diminished immune function, and now a pathogen that attacks red blood cells with extraordinary efficiency. And then, in what may have been the final weeks of his life, something else happened. The CT scans revealed a fracture to his left leg, just above the knee. The fracture showed no signs of healing, which means it occurred very shortly before death, possibly within days, given the condition of his foot and the ongoing bone necrosis. This kind of fall was not unlikely. A misstep, a moment of lost balance, a body that had been fighting for years finally betraying him at the worst possible moment. The scenario that emerges is not assassination, it is accumulation. A skeleton weakened by genetics, bones decaying from within, an immune system that couldn't keep pace with the infections targeting it, a severe fracture with no time to heal. And then, at the moment his body had the least to give, malaria struck again. The murder theory was never supported by the evidence. The skull damage that fueled it for decades had been caused during the mummification process. Itself, confirmed by scans as early as 2005, there was no assassin waiting in the shadows of his bedchamber. There was something far more inevitable, a body that had been failing for years, brought to its final limit by a cascade of compounding catastrophes. He was 19 years old. His death did not just end a reign, it ended a lineage. Inside his tomb, investigators found a small wooden box. Inside it, wrapped in linen and nestled carefully as if they were sleeping, were two mummified fetuses, girls, too small, too underdeveloped to have survived outside the womb. DNA testing confirmed they were Tutankhamun's daughters. Their mother, genetic analysis suggested, was Akhenaten, his queen, whose name appears on objects recovered from the tomb, and who was almost certainly his half-sister, the daughter of Akhenaten and Nefertiti. The genetic load carried by both parents was immense, and it seems to have made viable offspring impossible. 2 failed pregnancies, no surviving children. A king who could barely walk, ravaged by disease, dead before 20. The 18th dynasty, the dynasty that had produced Hatshepsut and Thutmose III and Amenhotep III at the height of Egypt's imperial power, ended not with invasion or rebellion, but with the quiet biological failure of a family that had turned too far inward. What followed was erasure. The military commanders who seized power after Tutankhamun's death, I first, then the General Horemheb, systematically dismantled the legacy of the Amarna period. Temples were demolished, inscriptions were chiseled from stone, the names of Akhenaten, Nefertiti, and Tutankhamun were removed from the official king lists, as if they had never existed. The heretics and everyone associated with them were consigned to oblivion. And here is the strange mercy hidden inside that cruelty. Because Tutankhamun's name was erased, because he was wiped from the record and officially forgotten, his tomb was never targeted, when later, pharaohs sent workers to cut new tombs nearby. The debris from their construction rolled down the hillside and buried his entrance under meters of rubble. Grave robbers who had looted the surrounding valley with systematic efficiency never found him. The very act of erasure became the mechanism of his preservation. 3,000 years passed. On November 4th, 1922, a water boy working for Howard Carter's excavation team struck something with his foot, a step, carved from the limestone bedrock, the beginning of a staircase leading down into the earth. 16 steps later, Carter was standing in front of a sealed doorway. The rest is the most famous discovery in the history of archaeology. But the greater discovery, the one that took another century to make, wasn't the golden mask or the gilded chariot or the alabaster canopic jars. It was the story written into the bones beneath the gold. The story that science eventually translated from DNA too fragile to see with the naked eye, from CT scans of a skeleton that had been waiting in the dark for 3,200 years. What those bones tell us now is something both grand and devastatingly personal. The fall of a dynasty isn't always driven by armies or politics or the ambitions of powerful men. Sometimes it comes from within, from the compounding weight of inherited biology, from a tradition that believed it was strengthening a bloodline by keeping it closed, not understanding that what it was actually doing was narrowing the margin for error until there was no margin left. Tutankhamun didn't fail Egypt. Egypt's oldest assumptions about blood and power and divine purity failed him. He was a child placed on the world's most powerful throne. He was a young man who could not cross a room without a cane. He was a king who watched his own children fail to survive, and he died in pain, quietly, before he ever had the chance to become whatever he might have been. Beneath the gold mask, beneath the divine titles, beneath 3,000 years of silence was a human being, and the science that finally gave him a voice didn't reveal a scandal. It revealed a tragedy, one that speaks across every century between his world and ours, about what happens when power convinces itself it is exempt from the laws that govern everything else. The bones in that museum don't lie. They never did. We just needed long enough to learn how to listen.